Welcome back, everybody. Thank you all for coming back on time. I am thrilled to be announcing our next presenter. Dr. Monica Williams is here to speak with us about cultural considerations in treating PTSD in people of color. We've heard already today about emotion regulation difficulties and how those may affect PTSD. We've heard about treatment options for PTSD and borderline personality disorder. We're now going to expand our focus and think a little bit about how to make sure that when we're treating PTSD, we are making sure our treatments are relevant and effective for all of our clients, all members of all communities. One brief reminder before we get started. This afternoon we're going to be hearing from Dr. Williams, some lived experience speakers, and Dr. Klonsky. As before, we will be talking about trauma. If you notice that you need to take a moment for self-care, to step out, to do something to use your coping skills, please do. There may be some material we talk about here that may be triggering for some folks. We invite everybody here to be using their coping skills. If you need treatment and you're not connected to treatment, there are some treatment facilities that have information and brochures out in the lobby. All right, please join me in welcoming Dr. Monica Williams.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here today and see all of you out here to learn about this topic. So just to briefly review what we're going to cover today, trauma is unique to people of color, how to assess for trauma due to racism, and some adaptations that you can make to existing behavioral interventions to address this. So what is trauma, right? And I think all of you here kind of know what trauma is. I don't know if I could find my mouse. We might define that as an experience involving actual or threatened injury or death and feeling intense fear, helplessness, or horror in reaction to that event that then doesn't go away. According to the DSM-5 criteria, you have to experience what's known as a Criterion A event in order for it to be classified as PTSD. And this means that you are exposed to death, serious injury, sexual violation in one of these ways. For example, directly witnessing it as it occurs to others, learning about it from that it occurred to a close family member or a close friend. Actual cases of death must have been violent or accidental, so that rules out some other situations, and experiencing experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events, and it's sort of specified sort of on the job, like for first responders, police officers, etc. Although this last piece, I think, does open the door for a more expansive understanding of the sorts of things that can be traumatizing. And so here is a list of some commonly recognized examples of Criteria A situations that may lead to traumatization. And certainly, anybody can experience these events. But there are a lot of other events, and we've heard this touched on today, that can also lead to PTSD symptoms that may or may not be classified or considered Criterion A events. And when we talk about these, I'm going to be talking about how they may be uniquely related to experiences of people of color in this country. But it can be, for example, unexpected losses, maybe bullying, harassment, levering power imbalances, or even racially motivated actions. And I think we can imagine situations where, for example, a kid at school may be bullied by other kids on the playground, and in the process of repeated bullying day after day, week after week, year after year, can become traumatized by this, and even maybe the person starts to think differently about themselves and the safety of the world in the face of this ongoing bullying. We also might see the same with, for example, sexual harassment, right? One experience of what might be considered a minor experience over time and repeated can again lead to symptoms of PTSD. Now, when we talk about racially motivated actions, this is an area where we find clinicians are often not thinking about racism as a route to traumatization. And before I go into this, I think it's important to define what we mean by racism, because there are many, many forms of racism, many types of racism, and the form of racism has changed somewhat over the decades. When we talk about racism, most people think about something like this: legalized segregation and Jim Crow laws, or people running around in white robes with pointy hats, and we call this old-fashioned racism. And this is still real today. These things do still happen, unfortunately, with the approval and protection of various municipalities. But for the most part, when we're talking about the kind of racism that results in the trauma of the larger majority of people of color in this country, it's not so much this overt kind of racism where you've got white nationalists with tiki torches shouting "White Lives Matter," right? So that being said, if we think about this event in Charlottesville, Virginia, which this was not too, this is a bit near and dear to my heart. I went to school at UVA, so I lived in Charlottesville for 7 years. And seeing this on the news was horrifying, although I have to say not completely surprising, given the history of Virginia and the fierce protection of these racist types of monuments and parks and holidays and so forth. I was actually in Germany at the time when this was going on, and even though I don't know any German, when I saw the local newspapers and pictures of this, I definitely understood a couple words in the headlines, including Charlottesville and Trump and a few other things that made me ashamed to be an American. But anyway, but I want you to imagine for a minute that this is happening and that you're in Charlottesville, Virginia. Imagine what it might be like if you're a child looking out your window and you're seeing these guys with these tiki torches shouting, "You will not replace us." Imagine if you were a Jewish child or a black child and you know a little bit about what people like to stand for, how horrifying that must be. Or as a parent, feeling like, how am I going to protect my family if this turns violent? So racism can be traumatizing, and it is happening today. Here are some common examples of racial traumas or things that can cause PTSD in people of color. Police harassment, search, and assault. So think about for a minute what it must be like to be pulled over in your car for driving. We sometimes, me and my friends, we might call it driving while black. So I'm black, so I use a lot of black examples. But being pulled over and for no reason, and having your car searched and your things all taken out of your car, put on the sidewalk in the rain, and then strip searched in public, cavity searched in public, partially exposed, and the police say, "Oh, we didn't find anything by," and you're left there to pick up the pieces. And imagine this happens to you not once, but several times, many times. That's a sexual violation, right? That's happening in public with no one to do anything about it. Nobody you can report this to. No one is going to go arrest these people for what they did to you, right? Workplace discrimination, and I see a lot of racial trauma surrounding workplace discrimination due to ongoing harassments and implied threats from coworkers. I'm serving now as an expert witness on a case where a professor was traumatized at work, which included having things like pictures of lynched people slipped under the door of his office, and coming into his office, discovering that his things had been taken and someone had urinated in there. So this can be traumatizing. Community violence for people who may live in unsafe neighborhoods due to poverty or gang violence or under or over patrolling of law enforcement. Murder of loved ones, in those environments, incarceration, which in and of itself is traumatizing. Also distressing medical and/or childbirth experiences. People of color often have a difficult time getting the same kind of medical care that many take for granted. And there are other kinds of traumas too that are particularly prevalent among immigrants and refugees, such as experiencing or witnessing torture, ethnic cleansing and persecution in your community, destruction of cultural practices, and I'm thinking even in this country, it wasn't really too long ago that Native American children were forced to go to boarding schools where their culture was intentionally extinguished and experienced a lot of abuse at the same time. Living in a war zone and immigration difficulties. I started a refugee clinic in Louisville, and the Cuban refugees we worked with, I would say, went through an average of, I want to say, 7 countries before getting to the US. And so you can imagine what a family might endure going through 7 different countries to get here. And then deportation, which can be traumatic. If you imagine, for example, what it's like to be a child and see your parents seized by authorities and taken away in front of you and not ever knowing what happened to them, and then perhaps being placed in foster care. So these are all things that can be traumatizing and disproportionately affect people of color. In addition to these, larger traumas, other types of experiences can be traumatizing as well. Any small experience experienced enough will eventually start to take a toll on people. And microaggressions are one form of racism that is considered a small act of racism, and so it often maybe flies under the radar. But these frequently occur in everyday situations, and they create uncertainty and anxiety in people of color, because every time one of these experiences happens, the person may be shocked, they may not know how to respond, they may ruminate about it. It may not be safe for them to call it out or do anything about it. And, and also the comments may reflect on them badly or underscore some aspect about them that is seen negatively by others. One recent research study that was looking at community college interactions in classrooms found that recorded microaggressions in 30% of classrooms. So they are happening often. And again, the targets are sort of forced to determine if the other person, in fact, did something discriminatory and whether or not it was intentional. So that contributes to feelings of anxiety and distress. How can you identify if something is a microaggression? Well, here's kind of 3 criteria that I came up with to help people identify them. First of all, they reinforce pathological or false stereotypes about different groups. They reinforce inequitable social norms and power differentials, and/or they communicate exclusion. So it's really important to understand that racial microaggressions, they're not just cultural missteps or racial faux pas, but they are actually a form of oppression that is designed to reinforce traditional power differentials between groups, whether or not this is the conscious intention of the offender, whether or not it's the person meant to do it. There's an underlying connection between the message embedded in the microaggression and its relationship to these pathological stereotypes and the target that reinforce these power structures. So microaggressions are fueled in part by racist stereotypes, and every culture does this. They have these stereotypes that explain differences between the in-group and the out-group in ways that pathologize the out-group, and then they use those stereotypes as a way to oppress the out-group. For example, although disadvantaged group members may have greater difficulty finding a job due to in-group favoritism or racism or related social forces, that disadvantaged group member is unjustifiably stereotyped as being unmotivated, like he could have found a job if he looked, or unintelligent, not smart enough for that job, or lazy, would rather take handouts, yada, yada, yada. So evidence of this is seen in the negative stereotypes and terms that are used to characterize African Americans in this country, as well as blacks in the UK and Turks in Germany and other cultures all around the world. So this is not a new thing. And it can be really difficult because these stereotypes are coming from everywhere. They're not just coming from, the guys with the tiki torches. They're coming from all segments of society. They're coming even from the upper echelons of society, even from the leadership of our country. And here's an example of President Trump advancing unfair and inaccurate false stereotypes about Mexican immigrants that in turn fuel hateful and pathological thinking about them. So, Trump is a very easy target, but these sorts of comments are made by people on both sides of the aisles and can be very, and take a toll on the people that are targeted. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of microaggressions. And these are, these categories are sort of derived from work done by Sue and colleagues and that we built on with research from our lab and focus groups that we did. And these are in your packet, so you don't need to write them down. But I also, often I see people taking pictures of these slides, and so I just want to tell you, microaggressions are context dependent. So just because, I have this example that probably is usually a microaggression, but you can probably come up with situations where it might not be. So it's important to understand that it depends on the situation, and if you just try to memorize, don't do these things, that's not going to work. So you have to kind of understand how they work. So here are a few examples that are very common. Some of these I experience all the time, and these types of comments again reinforce feelings of shame a person might have about their ethnic heritage. They kind of fuel feelings of anger because you're frustrated because you can't say anything back to the person, and they cause anxiety because you never know when they're going to happen. Here's a example of a microaggression from a project called I Too Am Harvard Tumblr, which highlights what Black Harvard students have to put up with on a regular basis. And this says, "No, I will not teach you how to twerk." Now we can all be insensitive for sure. No one is perfect, but the problem and what reinforces the power imbalance is, again, the person on the receiving end is not really free to explain, hey, that was kind of hurtful and a little bit racist, without the other person getting really angry and defensive. So that reinforces and perpetuates the problem, right? And here are a few other examples from our research as well. Again, very common, and I experience these things all the time. So again, these are common examples of microaggressions. They're everywhere. And you might ask yourself, what's the function of the microaggressions? Well, these have been going on since Dr. Chester Pierce first defined them in 1970. People of color have never liked them. We've never said to people, thank you for microaggressing against us. And yet they continue. And so, as good scientists, we have to ask ourselves, how are they maintained and what's the mechanism? So keeping in mind that these are common, ambiguous, subtle, innocent, unintentionally and racially motivated experiences that then produce stressful, anxiety-producing, and sometimes traumatizing reactions. These are socially learned. They're unspoken means of reestablishing dominance. And again, they're racially motivated. So you might ask yourself, but then how does that cause PTSD, right? How do we close that bridge? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples from real cases and people I've worked with. This is an example. This guy's name, we'll call him Dante. He's 25 years old. And he and three friends were traveling to visit family in North Carolina to celebrate his cousin's homecoming. The route was rural, and Dante found himself lost and driving through tobacco and cotton fields in the dark. He noticed a car ahead of him that pulled out and began traveling in the opposite direction, but then made a quick U-turn and started following him. And soon he started to get worried and was trying to evade this unknown vehicle. Eventually the vehicle turned on emergency lights, and it was apparent it was a police car. This did not make Dante feel relief at all. In fact, he became even more fearful, concerned about the risk to his life and his friends. He sped away, evading the police for miles until he crashed into a hardware store. Yeah. Dante was from Baltimore, a place where even the Department of Justice recognized that there are routine violations of the constitutional rights of Black people. And when I assessed Dante, he described a number of past traumatic experiences involving law enforcement, including witnessing and experiencing unexpected violence from police on multiple occasions. One of the most traumatizing experiences involved him walking to class with his backpack on, crossing the street, and being tackled by police who who basically said, "Don't move, we'll put a hole in your head." He really feared for his life. He broke his wrist in the fall, and then they said, "Oh, you're not the person we're looking for," and left. So he also had an experience where a neighbor in his apartment building was shot 20 times by police while watching television in his living room. The police said he had a weapon, which turned out to be a TV remote control. So growing up with these experiences, you can understand why Dante was fearful of law enforcement, because he didn't know whether they were going to help or harm him. And even though, in retrospect, he recognized he shouldn't have sped away from the police, in that moment of panic, he couldn't help himself because his trauma response took over. Here's another example of a young man named Tahaj Taylor of Denver. He was pulled over nearly 50 times in 4 years, which began to impact his mental health. So he doesn't have a record of any major crimes, but when he turned 18 in 2017 and started driving as a newly licensed driver, he started to be pulled over and over again. And so he became hypervigilant and constantly checking to make sure he had his license and registration, and was really surprised to discover his white college friends didn't have these same experiences. So experiencing an encounter with the police is a constant thought, he says. And then here's an example right from Yale. The issue of environmental microaggressions played out recently when, after much debate over racist imagery on campus, Corey Menifee, an African-American service worker, broke a stained glass window depicting smiling slaves carrying baskets of cotton. In explanation for his actions, he said, "As you look at it, it just hurts. You feel it in your heart, like, oh man, here in the 21st century, we're in a modern era where we shouldn't have to be subjected to these primitive and degrading images." So university officials struggled with how to respond to the situation. First, he was fired and charged with felony mischief, but then he was subsequently rehired after some controversy, but then told he couldn't speak out about what happened to him. So even though this event was framed as vandalism by some and activism by others, I don't think it was either of those things. I think it's more accurate to conceptualize his actions as a traumatic reaction to being forced to work in a racially hostile environment. We have actually 20 years of research that connects racism to negative mental health outcomes. Just about everything that's been measured is correlated to racism. And we know that there are some resilience factors, like, for example, a strong positive ethnic identity has been shown to be a potential protective factor against symptoms of anxiety and depression, unless the discriminatory events are severe, in which case that doesn't really help much. The National Survey of American Life has found that African Americans show higher prevalence of PTSD diagnoses than non-Hispanic whites, and we also see increased rates of PTSD among Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and Pacific Islander Americans and Southeast Asian refugees. And we know that history of any previous exposure to trauma is associated with a greater risk of eventually having a PTSD diagnosis from the index trauma. We call this sensitization. So this is consistent with the sensitization hypothesis. And on top of that, we also know that trauma is heritable. There was a really interesting study several years ago in the journal Nature, where mice that learned to associate the smell of a cherry blossom with an electric shock, would freak out whenever they would smell the cherry blossom because they thought the shock was coming. And they found that, and this was a study done with male mice, but then they found that the children of these mice had the same trauma response, and even some of the grandchildren. And so that was explained by that trauma was passed on through epigenetics, and that tells us something about what could be going on as well in groups that have been oppressed for a long time, who may be suffering from what we could call cultural trauma, in addition to being passed on through social roots. It may also be passed on through genetically as well. And there's research showing that children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are more susceptible to PTSD, and there have been some biological and inherited mechanisms identified. And we also see trauma passed down in other groups as well, such as descendants of internment camp survivors from World War II. Those were Japanese Americans who were imprisoned for really no good reason. Native Americans and that experience, including, this is a picture from the boarding school that I referenced earlier, and now we see high rates of addiction, suicide, mental illness, sexual violence, etc., which could be influenced by historical trauma. And then the whole African American traumatic cultural history, which includes being kidnapped from Africa, slavery, socially sanctioned rape, Jim Crow laws, segregation, and marginalization and discrimination, which continues into modern times. So how does this work? So basically, these racist incidents are traumatic, and they affect survivors in ways that are analogous to the effect that rape and domestic violence have on their victims. The acts of violation of an individual's personhood, the victim feels disempowered or powerless to do anything about it. The events are unpredictable and uncontrollable, and then may be invalidated by others who may challenge, ridicule, or dismiss what's happened. The reoccurring violence of microaggressions is similar to bullying or sexual harassment, and it's been postulated that subtle acts may be worse than overt acts. And in our research, we actually found that major discrimination was equally correlated to poor outcomes as everyday discrimination or microaggressions. So again, even microaggressions are traumatizing, and I just said that. And it's not because there's anything wrong with those who are experiencing microaggressions. Some people have postulated, well, maybe all these people who are complaining about racism are just neurotic, but actually blacks show less negative affectivity than whites, and so it's really not a sign of neuroticism. Really, people who just want microaggressions to stop, there's nothing pathological about that, actually. So we shouldn't pathologize people for asking to be treated well. We also, and so you can sort of model this as a cumulative stress model. So for many folks, they already have this foundation of cultural trauma. And then on top of that, they have the daily stress of dealing with things like microaggressions and everyday racism. And then you can have a traumatic event, and it could be something small or large that pushes the person from being in a situation where they're stressed to where they're now traumatized. And then when the person tries to talk to other people to process it or get help, they may be met with invalidation, which compounds the trauma further. And if they're seeking help from mental health care professionals, they may run into barriers to care and other forms of structural racism that prevent them from getting the help that they need. And I'll give an example of that in a minute. So how can clinicians help? First step is to accept that racial trauma is real and understand that racism is psychologically harmful. Acknowledge the mental health consequences of racism in all its forms. Assess racial trauma in people of color, and then implement interventions to help those who are suffering. And so here are a few issues that we face as a discipline. For one, existing PTSD measures aimed at identifying an index trauma typically fail to include incidents of racism among choice response options, leaving such experiences to be reported as other or squeezed into an existing category that may not really fit very well. Further, people of color may be reluctant to volunteer experiences of racism to their white clinicians, and white clinicians comprise the majority of mental health care providers currently. Additionally, they may worry that the clinician may not understand them, or that what they've experienced in other contexts will be replicated in therapy, where the other person becomes defensive or expresses disbelief. And then finally, they may not link their current symptoms to these cumulative experiences of discrimination if not asked, especially if they're just asked about a single event. And then finally, I should mention that there's no empirically supported treatments for racial trauma. Now, in terms of assessing racial trauma, we have a couple of scales that are out there that can get at some facets of this problem. The race-based traumatic stress and symptom scale is the only validated measure specifically for this, and that was designed by Carter, and unfortunately, it's extremely long and very hard to score. So, and if you ask Dr. Carter if you can use it, he'll want your data. So. It's not it's not used much, practically speaking, although we are doing some research with it. And then we have a few other measures, the general ethnic discrimination scale, which can be useful, experiences discrimination scale, racial microaggression scales, and then there's one we developed, trauma symptoms of discrimination scale. These are all self-report measures, and these can be great ways of starting the conversation with your clients. You can give them some of these measures, or you can include them in your intakes. And then when you meet with them, you can say, hey, I noticed on this measure you indicated you're having like a lot of discrimination-related stress at work. Can you tell me more about that? And that can be a great way to start the conversation if you don't know how to launch into it. And it can also these measures, giving them periodically, can be a good way to chart progress. Some other related cultural constructs you might want to examine as well, such as ethnic identity, acculturation, and and religiosity. There is a really great tool in the back of your DSM called the CFI, the Cultural Formulation Interview, which is a kind of a guided interview, really easy to use, comes in multiple languages, and can really help understand your client's culture. I have all my students practice giving this, and there's supplementary modules too if there are specific issues you want to know more about. Unfortunately, they forgot to make a module on understanding racism, discrimination, and oppression. I don't know why. So to fill that gap, we developed the UConn Racial Ethnic Stress and Trauma Survey, which does get at all of these different facets of racism. And it's available in English and Spanish, and we just finished a short version which can be used for people with any kind of marginalized identity as well. And so it's really important that you gather this information in addition to the information you might otherwise gather, so that you can have a real comprehensive picture of your client's traumas. And when we want to deliver trauma-informed care, here's 5 pillars. First of all, we want to avoid re-victimizing the client. We want to appreciate the many problem behaviors began as an attempt to cope. We want to maximize choices for the survivor and control over the healing process. We want to be culturally competent, and we want to understand the person in the context of their life experience and cultural background. Unfortunately, many well-meaning therapists accidentally commit racism. And this is really unfortunate, because most of us go into this profession because we care about people, but may in fact be committing microaggressions that seem positive at face value and not realize how these comments have affected clients. I'm going to give an example from a woman. She wrote about this, where she describes herself at the age of 16 as a single parent, and starting off very, very difficult, in a very difficult situation, and a lot of difficult things. She says, the stress and pressure that was my life became too much to bear. I could barely make it out of bed, and there were days that I just cried. I tried to keep it together, but I couldn't. I drank more than I should have. I wasn't living, I was just surviving. I confided in my mother about being completely overwhelmed with life. I needed help. I suggested therapy to help me cope, and she was against it. She said, don't go telling them people what happens in this house. What goes on in this house stays in this house. They're going to blame me anyways. They always blame the mother. Plus, you need to pray about it. It would be weeks of replaying that conversation over and over again in my head before I picked up the phone and called your office. So this is a letter to the therapist. She says, I had to force myself not to turn the car around and go back home several times. I made myself sit in your waiting area against my words of my mother and my faith. Why am I telling you this? I wanted you to know I was hanging on by a thread. You were my last hope. I didn't know what else to do, so I turned to a therapist, the drinking, crying, and feeling helpless. I told you about me and my struggles and how I was feeling inside, and you sat there in your expensive clothing, your perfectly decorated office, and smiled at me the entire time. When I finished being open, vulnerable, and raw, you said words that would haunt me to this day. And the therapist says, you seem like a strong black woman. You found ways to cope. I'm proud of you. Please come back if you feel like life is too much to handle. Yeah. She goes on to say, why didn't you hear me? Why didn't you acknowledge the internal battle between me, my culture, and my faith that I had to overcome? Why didn't you see all of me? Why did you ignore the tears that streamed down my cheeks? Why didn't you know I had enough of being strong? Perhaps you believe the stereotype that black women are strong and conditioned to handle stress better than white women like yourself. Maybe you accepted the belief that this is my lot in life. I'm destined to struggle and somehow make things work out. That's what you see on television, usually solved by the end of the episode. The strong, single black mom making it all work out in the end. I'm not strong because I want to be or because I'm trained to be. I'm strong because I have to be. You invalidated and ignored my pain, allowing me to nearly drown in my own sorrow because you didn't care enough to know me. I'm now speaking on decolonization and microaggressions in therapy. Not only do I share my story, but I share stories from other women who've had similar experiences. No, you didn't save me. Maybe I can help save someone else from just being a strong black woman and coping with it themselves. So that's part of her story, and you can read the rest of it. It's online. But she's by far not the first person who I've heard this story from. And so I think the first and most important thing we can do as therapists is validate these experiences of oppression, right? When a client discloses perceived discrimination and oppression, avoid automatically looking for alternative explanations, and validate the feelings. You weren't there, and as a stigmatized person of color who was present for the event, your client is in the best position to determine if something racist occurred. Believe them, right? So this is what you should take with you today. When someone opens up about these issues, don't question whether they really happened. Your client needs to feel heard, validated, and believed. This is not the time for Socratic questioning, right, as to whether or not it was really a racial event. Other things you can do as a therapist include identifying strengths and supports. A lot of times, strengths and supports can come from the person's own culture, and you can ask about this and use these as resources for treatment. Personal strengths like pride in their culture or religious faith, work ethic, interpersonal supports like extended family or traditional celebrations, and environmental supports, things like comfort foods or access to cultural activities and community. In other ways you can help people of color cope, place the blame where it belongs, and it could be on the perpetrator and secondarily our cultural dysfunction. Seek social support from within one's community, close friends, family, people who get it, not people who will be invalidating. Limit exposure to cues of racism as needed while recovering from a difficult situation. This may mean signing off of social media. Utilize religious or spiritual practices for comfort, or if the person doesn't have a religious faith, meditation or mindfulness. Seek positive distraction from cues of racism, engaging in pleasurable activities, for example, and rest and self-care. Peaceful activism, we might say making meaning from the pain, and educating others. And when educating others, be patient. This takes time to facilitate mutual understanding. So these are all functional coping strategies, and you can help clients implement these in their lives. You also want to look for harmful coping, which may include things like denial, substance abuse, aggression, self-blame, self-harm, and even suicidal ideation, which has also been linked to experiences of microaggressions. Some types of harmful coping that we see specifically in the African American community include things like the Superwoman syndrome, where basically you just feel like you have to do everything. Not at all restricted to African American community though. I see that in a lot of clients from every group, but I think this is particularly something that we struggle with, which is related to depression, exhaustion, and stress-related illnesses. A related phenomenon called John Henryism, for which we see in African American men, where in response to racial stressors, they just work harder and harder and harder and burn themselves out with problems like hypertension, arthritis, and other health problems. When we identify problems like this, you want to find out, is the trauma still happening, right? I mean, we've talked about, well, do you help people when the trauma is still going on? Victims do need space to heal. So as a therapist, you can help your clients identify the major sources of stress, and you may need to make a plan to change the environment. This could include finding a new job if you're experiencing workplace discrimination and harassment. It could mean changing your living situation if you've got roommates or a neighborhood that is not good, or you may have to remove toxic people as close friends, or minimize the contact with those toxic individuals. It's not easy, but it is often necessary. You want to help facilitate empowerment. In terms of therapeutic approaches to racial trauma, as I mentioned, there's really no empirically validated treatments at this point, but we do imagine that, we do think that good treatment options for people of color are probably culturally adapted variations of empirically supported treatments for PTSD. Here's one model from Lillian Comas Diaz. That being said, we did talk a little bit this morning about PTSD treatment trials and who's included and who isn't. And looking at diversity in the trials, we're currently doing a study now where we're looking at trials for of PE, of CPT, and EMDR, and we're finding that like half of these trials aren't even telling us anything about the racial makeup of the participants in those studies. And when we look at all of the studies together, we do see some diversity represented, but a lot that we weren't able to identify even after we contacted the authors of the studies. And just to give you a snapshot of the findings, the EMDR was the least inclusive of Blacks and Latinos and Asians. There were no Blacks and no Asians in any of the studies we found, and Latinos were 0.8%. PE was the most inclusive of Black and Latino Americans. Black Americans were well represented. Latinos, however, only 3.5%. And cognitive processing therapy was most inclusive of Asian Americans at 2.5%. So our research indicates that people of color are not adequately represented in these efficacy trials for PTSD, and so clearly this is an area, an important hole in our knowledge. So more work needs to be done there. We did recently develop a group treatment for racial trauma that is actually in use at several VA sites right now, and I don't have time to go into details, but it's going well. And I have an overview of what this treatment involves. It's in your handouts, it's in small print, but we did recently publish a paper on this and in Psychology of Violence, which talks about the treatment approach, that group treatment approach. And so a lot of people ask, what can we do, what can well-intentioned white people do about racism? And I'm going to close with just a few points here. Learn. Our understanding of racism is very different than in the past, so learn the new language. Learn what are microaggressions, implicit bias, white privilege, etc. Get better at accepting rather than avoiding difficult feelings surrounding race, right? So if you've got interracial anxiety, you need to work on that in order to be effective with your clients of color. Explore and get curious about your own stereotypes and biases. We all have them, so we need to understand what they are and how to deal with them. Commit to be active and part of the solution. And finally, connect and take risks to forge real relationships with others who are different than you. You learn so much that way. And that's my talk. Thank you.
just grab this microphone.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I have a pile of questions that is accruing for you. One question that's come in from the audience is there any knowledge on whether intentional versus unintentional microaggressions are more or less toxic to people who are already experiencing trauma?
Yeah. Yes, that's a really good question. And in our research, well, we are still in the very early stages of this. We are still actually developing the tools to measure the microaggressions and their impact, but our preliminary research does seem to indicate that there is a divide, there does seem to be a clear divide between these microaggressions that appear intentional, in other words, that have some degree of aggression, of conscious aggression behind them, versus others that seem to be unintentional. And we think that, it's really kind of hard to say, because the unintentional ones are sometimes by people that you know and respect and you care about, and it can be really hurtful when somebody that you care about says something harmful versus, maybe just somebody that you bumped into at Starbucks who makes a rude comment. So we don't know which of those is more harmful or less harmful at this point.
Thank you. I have another question here from a clinician who writes, as a clinician of color who has clients who are or identify as white, how does the clinician address microaggressions from some clients who may present as resistant to treatment due to verbalized or implicit, internalized, or unconscious beliefs that may be racially motivated, whether they are aware of it or not? Complicated question.
Yeah, but a really good question, and a question I hear a lot from trainees of color, because often we don't get any training on how to manage that when we're in school or under supervision. But I do think it is important that if your clients are aggressing against you in any way, it has to be brought to the client and become a topic of conversation, and certainly it has to be done very sensitively. But I think it is a mistake to just to let those comments go and to accept them, because that person, if they're microaggressing against you as a therapist, they're doing the same to other people of color, and that's impacting those relationships too. And as a therapist, we're interested in their functioning as a whole person, which includes how they interact with people of color or other stigmatized groups. So I would say it does have to be addressed. Sue came out with a really good article recently in the American Psychologist on how to respond to microaggressions, and there's some really good ideas in there and tips. Of course, some of the responses wouldn't be suitable to say to your client, but it's a good starting place. So yeah.
I want to really highlight that what you just said actually indicates that this is a public health issue, right? This isn't just the person experiencing this, but failure to address it as a clinician means that behavior is going on out into the world.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, racism as a whole is a public health problem. As you saw from the slide I showed you, with all of those connections between the many different types of disorders. And so as mental health clinicians, and just as we would advocate against things like child abuse, we should also be advocating against racism in all of its forms.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions on this same theme. And the basic question is, how can we as clinicians bring awareness of our own unconscious biases and our own tendency to commit microaggressions? It is difficult to become aware of what one is not aware of. Are there trainings, for example, or approaches you might recommend?
Yeah, good question. So, so for a lot of us who were trained back in the dark ages, not that long ago, I graduated in 2007. I never got any training in my program on how to work with people cross-culturally. Everything I learned, I had to kind of teach myself. And so I know there's a whole generation out there who never got any training in school, and then the younger generation is getting training, and some of it's good and some of it's not. So I think we all have to avail ourselves of more training in order to effectively treat our increasingly diverse society. Right now, half of all births are children of color. So half of all children are people of color. And so if we're going to remain relevant as therapists and as a discipline, we're going to have to take it upon ourselves to get that training that we missed and didn't get. And I think there's a lot of good ways to do it. There are a lot of diversity trainings. I have to be honest, a lot of them are really bad. And I think you know this. You probably sat through bad ones. I had to when I got my job at UConn. We all had to go to this horrible diversity training, and I just wished I could just go up there and do it myself. But So you have to do your homework, but you can learn a great deal, and I'm also going to be starting a peer group for therapists who want to continue to learn more about how to grow as individuals and how to improve their work as therapists. So I think opportunities like that, and also finding supervisors to weigh in and help you with cases across racial and ethnic differences can be a really good way of learning as well.
So I have another question for you that gets back to the public health piece of this. There's another question here on what do you recommend people do out in the community when they witness microaggressions? Are there responses you could recommend or resources you could point us to?
Yes, I think we need to call them out when we see them, because usually the victims of the microaggressions, again, are disempowered, and if you're in a more privileged or powerful position by nature of your race or gender or your profession or education, then you're in a better place to weigh in and help to make that person who's the victim feel supported, and let the perpetrator know that wasn't okay. And certainly, a lot of skill and tact is required. It takes practice. And the sad fact is, so many of us have no practice at all talking about racial issues, because just that's how people are socialized in this country. And so it does take practice, but it can be learned like any skill. And again, I would refer folks to the recent article by Sue, an American psychologist, as a starting place.
Thank you. I have a bit of a science-y question for you now. Some studies combine race and ethnicity, and some measure them separately. This gets a little tricky when it's thinking about our knowledge about evidence-based treatments and for which groups of people in which communities they may be most effective. What is the best way to be measuring this?
Yeah, I think you have to separate out ethnicity, because even though, for example, Black Americans may include African Americans like myself, who were born here and our families have been here for generations, but it may include Caribbean Americans who may be first generation or second generation immigrants. It may include recent immigrants from Africa. All of us may be classified as Black racially, but we're all different ethnic groups. And I think to really understand the nuances of these constructs, I think you have to look at ethnicity. For example, in my studies, we always ask, are you an immigrant? When did you come here? When did your family come here? So that we can tease those apart as needed when we're analyzing our data.
Thank you. And one more question. Are there resources for clinical supervisors that you can recommend for supervising students who might be of the same race or ethnicity, or supervising across racial and ethnic communities?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. I can put in a plug for my new book that's coming out.
Not a plant, I swear.
Yeah, so a New Harbinger book. We're coming out with a book eliminating race-based mental health disparities, and we have a whole chapter on supervising trainees of color in the book, and so I suggest you just get the whole thing. It's all good, really all good. And it's also a great textbook for classes. So yeah, it does require a special. You have to do a little extra different when you have supervisees of color, and you do need to acknowledge the racial differences, and invite your supervisees to call you out, and then be okay when they do. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Would you all join me in thanking Dr. Williams?